as a church historian, the passage that is really close to my heart is Hebrews 13:7, that tells us to remember our leaders and to think about their way of life and to imitate their faith. And Hebrews also talks about a great cloud of witnesses that the writer even brings to the audience's mind to remember that there have been a lot of heroes of the faith that have gone before us. And it can benefit us to learn from their mistakes as we are dealing with some of the same challenges that are not always new under the sun. And also we can also emulate their strengths and learn from the successes and the great advances they've made in the spread of the gospel and the growth of the church. And so I really think that church history is a value for us, and I'm so grateful that you're taking the time to learn a little bit about our history. And this class is especially important, I think, because even in everyday life, many of us are somewhat familiar with Western church history. For example, most of us have heard the names Martin Luther or John Calvin. We might not know a whole lot about them, but we've heard their names. And on the other side, there's even many church historians and theologians who have never heard the names of Ephraim the Syrian or Zara Yacob. And these are also theologians who have done a lot, were prolific, and oftentimes even preceded people that we might know about. And so the purpose of this course is to help us understand that Christianity has always been a global religion. It's often the case that people think that Christianity came into the global sphere in the modern time period for the last 5 centuries. And so oftentimes we think of church history as something that was Western and grew through the Roman Empire and Western Europe and then came over into North America and then went out into the rest of the world in a much later time period. And we talk about the 19th century and the early 20th century as the Great Mission century. And indeed, there was tremendous gains and tremendous growth for global Christianity. But sometimes we think about it only as a result of Western colonialism. And there's oftentimes nowadays a desire, understandably so, to disentangle Christianity or certain expressions of Christianity from a certain kind of colonial or oppressive root. And this is something that we have to grapple with because there is a long story that we're somewhat familiar with about how Western Christianity came into many parts of the world through the vehicle of colonialism and even slavery. And this is one of many examples where Christianity was embedded with slavery and with colonialism. And now, several hundred years later, Christians are working to disentangle the embeddedness of Western colonialism and the legacy of slavery with Christianity and with Christian missions, and are working to disentangle Western hegemonic power over the global church and to empower indigenous Christians to lead their own churches in indigenous and contextualized ways. But this is still a struggle in the 21st century that we are still facing and having to work at. There have been great strides over the last century, but there's still much work to be done. And because of that, many post-colonial theologies and ministry methods have developed in the last century especially. Post-colonialism is a social science and historiographical theory that tries to look at history and the study of societies from the perspective of the most marginalized and not from the perspective of those in power. And this has come into theological circles as well. And even in our day, as we are becoming more and more aware of how so many Christian institutions have unfortunately been complicit in acts of oppression and racism and colonialism, that now there is a desire to decolonize our theology, or to have an anti-racist theology, or to have a post-colonial theology. And this kind of idea of the entrapment that people face, especially for people of color and especially for Christians of color, this dynamic was expressed very astutely by the African-American scholar and activist W.E.B. Du Bois, who was one of the first African-American graduates of Harvard University and also eventually moved to Ghana and was instrumental in the formation of the modern nation state of Ghana. And in his classic work, The Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois said this with regard to this concept of a double consciousness, or this sense that African Americans, but also other marginalized people groups, have felt this sense of double consciousness of having a double identity, one that is self-defined and yet another that is imposed upon by those in power. And he said in The Souls of Black Folk, the worlds within and without the veil of color are changing, and changing rapidly, but not at the same rate, not in the same way. And this must produce a peculiar wrenching of the soul, a peculiar state of doubt and bewilderment. And so Du Bois says that the imposed identity of Western colonial Christendom, as he said, must produce a certain wrenching of the soul. And so there's this sense in which people have to grapple with the double consciousness, and especially in a theological sense, of a double consciousness of owning one's Christian faith in an indigenous way, but grappling with an imposed Western expression of Christianity. Well, in this class, I want to invite us to be able to go beyond the veil of color, or to go beyond imposed identities, and to go beyond the idea that Christianity is inherently embedded with colonial practice. One of the fascinating and empowering things about the fullness of church history is that Christianity did not only come from the West to the rest. It's a very common perception in our day and age that Christianity is a Western religion. If you're in a non-Western context, it is very common for people to see Christianity as a Western religion, that it is a product of the Western world, that Western culture and Christianity are inseparable. And the related supposition is that Christianity is antithetical to non-Western cultural identities. And so you can see how this is a very big problem. And if you talk to any missionary who serves in an Asian or African or indigenous or Pacific Islander context, you will know that this is actually the single greatest obstacle to the spread of the gospel in our world today. The perception that Christianity as a Western religion is the single greatest barrier to people coming to faith in Jesus Christ. I say that because most human beings in the world are not Western. And if you talk to that majority world and you talk to non-Christians in the majority world and ask why they're not interested in becoming a Christian, I guarantee you the number one answer you're going to hear is because Christianity is for Western people and not my people. And so this work of history is not only historical, but it's also evangelistic and missional. We have to help people understand that Christianity is not becoming a global religion. It didn't just go from the West to the rest, but Christianity started with a multi-ethnic gathering of people at Pentecost, and it went from Jerusalem in every direction into Africa and Asia and in Europe. And Christianity has been global from the very beginning. I say this because even in some missiological circles, it can happen often that this perception that Christianity was Western and then one day became diverse is still a common perception. A missiologist named Andrew Walls, for example, whom I greatly respect and has influenced my thinking in significant ways, says this in a way. In one of his writings, he says here, "But in our own day, the Ephesian moment has come again, and come in a richer mode than has ever happened since the first century." And what Walls means here by the Ephesian moment is he's referring to the epistle to the Ephesians, where that book was largely dealing with the issue of Jewish and Gentile relations and how these groups that had been separate have now come together in a new sense of unity. But it's also brought about new questions of church unity and cross-cultural differences and contextualization. And Walls is saying that in the 20th century and early 21st century, that now we have come to that moment again. And I understand what he's saying because it's true that there has been levels of diversity and Christian context in the last century and a half that had not been present before in church history. But I also think that we have to be careful when we talk about Christianity becoming global, or we overstate the case and we forget that Christianity is not becoming global. It didn't used to be Western and then become global. And even in many of our seminaries and our Christian colleges, we teach history in a way that actually says exactly that. We focus on church history in the Roman context, in the European context, in the white North American context. And then towards the end of the class, we start to talk about global Christianity, which is Christianity in the majority world. And we get to it towards the end. Or oftentimes, Christianity in non-Western context is seen as something that's added on, but there's this Western core that we see as primary. And so we have to think about ways that we are even exacerbating that perception that Christianity is a Western religion, whether that has to do with our Christian institutions or our schools or who is on our reading lists. And we have to think about representing the fullness of God's church. And that's exactly what we are going to do in this class as we look at the early history of Christianity so that we can understand and have a deeper sense of how Christianity is and always has been a global religion.